I guess that leaves us actually with a pretty good segue to kind of to get back into the human rights portion of this discussion, which is we've talked a lot about like the coordination at like a more theoretical level of like, well, these people, coordinating like big aid can like talk to each other in these clusters. So then what is what is the best way then practice for like on the ground where like aid is being given out or allocated in order to protect human rights? What's the best version of that cooperation? If that question made sense.
Yeah, I want to pick up on something Louise said earlier. I'm not sure I totally agree with him, but I do think there's something about using the particular expertise of the private sector to do what they do best. I'm thinking, for example, after the Haitian earthquake, Digicel did a good job, given the situation, at getting cell phones restored, or some of the tech companies that provide that level of getting the system functioning again, getting communications back up. And I think about areas like logistics, communications, technology, supply chains, is areas where companies have a real advantage, and frankly, the humanitarians have a lot that they could learn from them. But there's a whole group of problems where I don't think the private sector has a dominant role to play. For example, we know that after sudden onset disasters, the rate of sexual and gender-based violence goes up. It's endemic in a lot of situations. There's more domestic violence, there's more stranger violence, there's sexual exploitation and abuse by humanitarian workers. It's a whole bunch of basic protection issues that come up where, I think in spite of some companies really wanting to engage in this, it requires a different kind of intervention. So, I think we need to consider in each situation what kind of assistance is needed. In the case of sexual gender-based violence, sometimes you need more police on the ground. You need more police cars and communication and just local law enforcement, which, often after a sudden onset disaster has lost a lot of its capacity and may not see issues like, well, 3 women got raped last night as a major concern when everything else is falling apart. But, so I think you need some system, and so far what we seem to have is the clusters, imperfect though they are, to identify what are the main things we need, and then how can we reach out to the corporate sector. Maybe each of the clusters in these big emergencies should have a corporate liaison person, just like now we've got military liaison people in certain situations who could reach out to the corporate sector and make sure that they understand what's going on and how their contributions can be used, and also see opportunities for learning from them so it isn't just a one-way street.
Certainly a need for, the different assets that they can provide is important, and being able to channel that in the way that's most appropriate for that particular situation. I would have a difficult times, I can see maybe having a corporate liaison for the logistics cluster, but I think that for some of the other, it just becomes a bit more challenging, just because like sometimes there's like this panoply of actors and what they're providing. And so that, just like the NGOs may not want to be represented by just like one focal point, to speak on their behalf. I think that could be challenging, but I think that's something to explore and to be able to leverage, again, the strengths that, the military, as you bring up, and I think is a great example, as well as, the resources that are there and that are being made available by the corporate sector. I think, practically on the ground, and these different spaces look different. And so looking at how even organizations can better equip themselves to best manage and to mitigate, situations of sexual and gender-based violence, or even, sexual exploitation and abuse, which is something that, we've had to contend with more scandals about over the last few months than we have throughout the last 20-somewhat years. And it's not because there weren't occurrences of it, but it's, that, we're speaking about it now. And I think that that's definitely become a space, I think, of curiosity for some corporate partners, for some businesses that see, that these are supposed to be, the main responders, and they're supposed to be the most ethical, and look at the scandals that are coming out. And so having the right, safeguarding policies in place, I think for humanitarians is really important for the aid sector. And I think, maybe finding something, comparable, to be able to, establish a set of guideline relationships with different corporate partners. In Congo, when I was with the peacekeeping mission there, we were working closely on protection of civilians with telecommunications companies that were providing us with, either building additional towers or with the technology that we needed. But we also knew that we didn't want them to work directly with some of the populations that we were working with, just because there was a lot of ethnicities, there was a lot of challenges around that. And so we needed to be those interlocutors. But you need to establish yourself also as a trusted partner. And so I think that that's important for, local organizations, INGOs, to establish themselves as such, so that then they can best leverage those resources, but also, make sure that that entity feels as though they can entrust you with those resources, and they know that you will do, what's best with them, as opposed to leaving it in their hands. And it could be that they've never been involved in a disaster necessarily, and you bring the expertise, you bring the know-how. So I think being able to build those relationships, to have the tools, the assets, so that you know how to, what to expect, I guess, of one another, is really important.
Yeah, you mentioned having like a set of guidelines for businesses to use. So would this, I guess in the ideal world, be guidelines issued by the clusters we've all been talking about that businesses would then like universally comply with? I mean, just how would you mechanize that type of guideline?
Sure. So I could see something. I mean, it would have to be a joint effort. So I would have a difficult time seeing something come out. First of all, it would take forever through the cluster system, but certainly the IESC and the cluster system eventually could come to be. But it would have to be a joint effort to ensure that there is, some type of collaboration, that the business entities, wherever that situation might be, has weighed in. And then I think maybe having, a couple of different sets, maybe one for sudden onset, where the government, the state has the capacity to respond, and then another where, you have a complex emergency and potentially weaker capacity on the part of the state to be able to implement. Because I think that, there's a lot of different variations, but at least having some toolkit where, that you can, adapt to the context, of course, but a set of guidelines. And the civil military space, still has a lot of work to do, but I think civil military guidelines for humanitarian emergencies has definitely fleshed this out pretty well for sudden onset, for natural disasters, and less so because it's just a little trickier, obviously, for complex emergencies. But I think that they've, developed certain ones for certain contexts, and that helps. And then building awareness of that.
Yeah, there are also some general principles that have been agreed in the UN's Global Compact, which is a mechanism to work with business leaders in support of the Sustainable Development Goals. That's at least a starting point. I don't know, maybe Sandrina knows if something similar has been done on the humanitarian side. I know there's been some talk of different kinds of business coalitions working together, particularly on the issue of refugees after the 2016 summit, but I don't know if they've published a set of principles or guidelines. But, related to that, I think it would be really helpful if the corporate sector could develop its own mechanisms to coordinate with each other, to work together. That I think would probably make it easier to interact with the humanitarians. Anyway, so I think that there are some possibilities for moving forward.
Ms. Cruz, can I ask, so you've mentioned quite a bit your vetting process for the organizations you choose. Is a component of that process organizations that look to protect human rights or anything related to the protection of human rights?
So what we look at is a number of things. We look through their financials. We look at the their board of directors and the members of their senior team. We run those names against some of the public databases, making sure that, they're compliant with anti-terrorist laws. And so a lot of that is looking to ensure that the organizations are doing charitable work in an accountable and transparent manner. And then what we have that kind of, I guess, dovetails that is that we have an investigation team here. And so we take any, how can I say, any concerns that people may have, any allegations, and then we investigate those, and then we will look further into that. And I would say that the ones that are at the top of that list is, concern for stakeholders who may be mistreated in some way, so human rights violations. I will say that, interestingly enough, in preparation for this conversation, I talked to that team to see, kind of how this, what this looks like across the development work that we do and the disaster relief and recovery. And there's actually been no complaints filed for the relief that's given in disaster, which is really interesting, because that is sort of the, what we've often seen as the peak time for increased human rights violations and protection issues. But one thing that we're trying to do now is to provide more of a peer learning network, which we do in other areas, but for safeguarding. And so really looking at organizations that maybe already have child protection guidelines in place, safeguarding different, I guess, policies, and be able to share that with other organizations who maybe don't have it, or maybe want to improve on what they currently have. So we're trying to see how we can also fill that space for our especially smaller local partners. But it's not something that we've definitely, like, we don't have any in-house experts necessarily. So we're trying to figure out how we can, provide more for our nonprofit partners.
That's excellent. Thank you so much. So I guess then, as we're wrapping up, because we only have about 10 minutes left, is just to kind of bring it all together then. So what, I guess, either of you in your professional opinions would be like the ideal kind of way in which, like, you see the intersection of like private sector aid interacting with NGOs to like create the aid that could then best protect human rights while still giving like adequate relief. If you can sum that up in like 5 minutes or less, each of you.
I don't know, it's hard to think of something new to say. I mean, I think that the private sector is really kind of an untapped potential in a lot of disasters. They've got a lot to contribute, and that on the humanitarian side, there has to be more flexibility and more creative ways of working with the private sector. Traditionally, humanitarians have seen the private sectors give us money and let us do the work. And that's really changing, and that's a very positive development. Once you get into human rights issues, I make most basically to make sure that any new actors don't do harm. They don't make things worse for people in these situations, whether unknowingly or in pursuit of different objectives. I mean, I think that's kind of basic. But I think maybe more human rights awareness of people who are participating in aid operations. Sometimes there's a sense that, human rights just refers to civil and political liberty, freedom of speech, assembly, religion, et cetera. And yet, particularly we see after natural disasters, there are all kinds of ways that rights are violated. And sometimes people just aren't aware, that the way they're distributing food. I remember, again, in Haiti, shortly after the earthquake, watching U.S. military forces who, from the best of intentions, saw thirsty people and started handing out water. And before they knew it, there was a riot. They just didn't understand how there are ways to distribute food items or non-food items in ways that are well, and it really provoked a big backlash and a lot of hard feelings. So I think just being aware of some of the human rights issues would be really good. Maybe, I like to think more creatively, maybe it'd be good to, some programs so that NGOs can, send their staff to intern with a corporation for a few weeks a year, or vice versa. Let some of the the corporate types, spend 6 weeks or 2 weeks or a week with Human Rights Watch or with International Rescue Committee, kind of seeing the day-to-day challenges and getting a sense as to how human rights work in practice. That might be more effective than coming up with a list of agreed principles developed by one of these coordination mechanisms. So I think there's a lot of potential for doing more in this area, and I think it's going to mean people on both sides changing their attitudes a little bit, which is always the hardest part of doing anything.
I would definitely agree. I think that in some ways, though, necessity being the mother of invention may be on our side in this case, because we are seeing, I think it was Louise that mentioned that decreased in the traditional resources that we're normally used to seeing. And so hopefully that means that, we're more open to working with the private sector and working more in a collaborative fashion. And so less looking to tie down those different relationships bilaterally, but opening it up. And when it comes to human rights, it's a matter of communicating. I think that if we were talking to some corporate executives, or at least the teams that manage the CSR departments, that they might be surprised, at what we might list as the top, set of human rights concerns, violations that we see in the aftermath of a disaster. And I think just that awareness, just that communication, and having that happen potentially, yes, as the two main groups, spending time with one another. I think more than that, also including development actors, as we're seeing, natural hazards in some of these areas where you have more sort of traditionally development organizations, and learning about that as well. And so that they can also, as they're pivoting to potentially respond to a disaster, they're more aware of the concerns and of the red flags. And I think that internally for organizations, for traditional humanitarian organizations who are aware of these issues, I think sometimes it becomes difficult to work together to mitigate it. I think it's, especially when you don't have a well-resourced response, I think it can be quite frustrating that you identify all of, this whole host of issues, but that, you don't have enough capacity to respond. And I think being able to better coordinate on that front, also better resource, I guess on the part of the NGOs, and I know that this is difficult, especially for some environments. We often talk about, how some experts, potentially in child protection or gender-based violence, go to certain sort of more high-profile environments where the others are missing out on that. But how do you divide, really great resources amongst your various response settings? I think that's really important as well.
Thank you both so much for participating, and staying in for the long haul at the conference. I really appreciate it.